This is the story of how a MIT rocket scientist went from a ping pong player to an absolute unit in terms of dunking. This is a story of Webster Guan. Webster has been working with us for years. I think at this point he's about 3 or 4 years in. Started working with him during COVID, I think it was around 2020 or so, and he still works with us today. He's actually hopped off the service at one point, and we'll get into that in today's story time. What's up, guys? My name is John Evans. I coach many of the highest jumpers in the world, one of which is Isaiah Rivera, my business partner. If you guys are looking for coaching and you want to know how Webster went from this to this, then go to THPStrength.com. So Webster is an interesting individual because it's very rare for us to come across an athlete who is an absolute genius. And when I say genius, I'm not using that term lightly. I mean, this guy is literally a rocket scientist. I don't know if he studies rockets, but he's very, very smart. I mean, he is a PhD from MIT. That is basically as smart as they come. And I take a lot of pride in that because as someone who values the quality of the information or the quality of what they're doing, it is absolutely flattering when an athlete or when an individual as smart as Webster trusts us with their training. It's very obvious that he's a critical thinker, he's super intelligent, and the fact that he trusts us with his training, I think says a lot about the quality of the information that you're getting from us. So Webster's interesting because he is classically, in the nicest way possible, a nerd. He grew up doing no sports whatsoever. He literally did ping pong. That is what he did, ping pong. No football, no soccer, no baseball, no track and field. I mean, this guy literally played ping pong on a competitive team. That is what he did. Otherwise, he was just studying. His nose was behind or in the books, and he was reading a lot, studying a lot, doing his homework. I mean, worked super, super hard in terms of his academics, but his time was largely spent on that and not on sports. I don't know if it wasn't encouraged or whatever else, but he loved sports, just didn't really play them. So it's not like Webster grew up and was this freak athlete like Donovan or Isaiah who did a bunch of different sports and had a very well-balanced, multilateral approach to his long-term athletic development. I actually asked him if he was like flat out sedentary. He's like, I was maybe a level above sedentary. I really just went out at recess and had PE, but that was pretty much the extent of my physical education. So Webster actually was an early bloomer. He was about 6'1" when he was 15 and started playing volleyball when he was like 13 to 14, maybe in that range. And then as a freshman, he said he played on his nerd volleyball team. And at that point, he played for the rest of his high school time there and just on this kind of like little volleyball team or whatever. And that was really the extent of his experience as an athlete in high school. He just casually played volleyball and he could grab rim. Now, mind you, Webster is 6'1" and his reach is around 8 foot or just under. It's kind of funny. Webster actually has almost the same exact proportions to me in terms of height and reach. And I thought that was actually pretty funny. In terms of his vertical, it's actually super similar as well. His current vertical or all-time vertical, we think is just a hair under 40. We think he's about 39, maybe 38.5, which is really impressive considering where he started at. So essentially, Webster went to college, and during this period of time, like I said, he basically just grabbed rim, and he was playing a ton of basketball and really just started doing a bro split. That's his words, not mine. So for those first 2 years of school, he really was just doing a little bit of jumping, and I think actually did jump manual, and eventually got to the point where he could get about his wrist over the rim, but he was not dunking. He also was a 1-foot jumper. He was not a 2-foot jumper, which I found to be very interesting because now he's quite talented at dunking off 2 feet. I mean, we're talking 360 windmills, slingshots, all that different stuff. I mean, Webster really is quite high level considering where he started at. So then about his sophomore year, Webster ends up spraining his ankle periodically while he's training and playing a lot of basketball, but he actually does get his first dunk off 1 foot, which roughly he thinks he was touching like 10.7 or so. So on a 10-foot rim, that's about where you need to be to get your first dunk. And that was off 1 foot. So that's where he started. He's about 19 years old. And what you'll see as I go through the story is that's pretty much where the level he stayed at for a very, very long time. And the reason for that is that Webster really wasn't training well and definitely not consistently. And he is actually incredibly, incredibly injury prone. And that is a big thing that I had to learn in coaching him, is that Webster had a lot of injuries that I had to work with him pretty closely to figure out how to train around those issues and actually help him improve during that period of time. So basically, during his entire undergraduate experience, he's really jumping a ton, playing basketball a ton, playing volleyball a ton, periodically just keeps spraining and re-spraining his ankle, and his vertical pretty well stagnated. So he's jumping essentially every day, got his vertical up to about 33 inches at this time, but was dealing with a ton of nagging injuries. He thinks he probably got up to the point where maybe he was touching 10.9, 10.10, and this is pretty much the entire peak of his college experience. Now, being at MIT, you're obviously incredibly strained in terms of your time, where you really don't have time to do anything else outside of just studying. And considering that he was, I guess, an engineering major, he really did not have a ton of free time to be able to train in the way that maybe he would have wanted to. So he's more or less just kind of fluctuating or flowing in and out of good training and bad training. I would say mostly bad training, getting hurt and having these periods where he's jumping, 5 days a week or whatever, and then just kind of keeps cycling through this period of time. He was never really not doing like nothing, I would say. So in terms of specificity, he's getting a lot of jump volume in, right? Like if you're jumping every day for a period of time, you're going to get better. And that makes sense. That first 2 years, he gets his first dunk or whatever, and then he gets up to the point still training and doing jump training, but built in with all this other stuff. He's not really focusing on anything, but he got up to the point where he's touching 10.10. I mean, that tracks. So then towards the end of his time in his undergraduate degree, Webster has his first big injury, and that is that he sprained his big toe and he had a very bad medial bunion. Now, he probably had turf toe, and a bunion is basically where a bone starts growing on the side of your feet and essentially can be really, really uncomfortable. I actually have bunions on both of my feet. They're very common in jumpers, and he just kind of started to run into these little nagging injuries. So his first year of his PhD, which we'll call like his freshman year or whatever, basically does the same thing he's been doing unstructured lifting, playing volleyball, and more or less doing plyos occasionally during that it's essentially entire year. However, during that time, he actually broke his pinky. So now he comes in, he's got some issues with his big toe. Then he goes to his freshman year, he breaks his pinky, which he said really actually impacted him. And then during that period of time, he also had a lot of shoulder issues. I don't know if it was a dislocation or whatever else, but he started getting a lot of issues in his shoulder. So then the next year in 2018, he's basically just focused on trying not to get fat, is really focused on his PhD during this time, which again makes sense. He's at MIT. You don't really have the luxury of not focusing on your schooling during that period of time. So during 2018, he's in his third year of his PhD at MIT, and he joins the club ultimate team. He's not really training at this time at all, and he's really just working and more or less just keeps getting hurt because he doesn't really have a good training plan. So after he finishes all of this time just grinding out his PhD, he basically gets to a point where he realizes, like, I haven't really achieved any of my life goals. I haven't really done anything. I've just more or less focused on my PhD. I'm now like 24 or 25. I haven't achieved any of the things that I wanted to athletically, and I probably should start like taking this a little bit more seriously. He more or less had just grinded out his PhD that entire time, and so now he starts reaching out to us to try to fix a lot of the injuries that he had developed through all these years, and more or less comes to me not really having any time. He has a bunch of injuries, and his goal is to get back to jumping higher. I don't even know if he could dunk at this time. He had pretty much spent all of his time on his PhD and not really training outside of just playing volleyball. He maybe could dunk off one, but that was probably the extent of what he could do. So COVID hits, and it's like March 2020. He's 26 at this point. He feels like he's wasted his life, and as a result, he's like, I really want to lean into my hobbies. So he buys VertShock. He said he was actually ashamed of himself, and obviously does VertShock and basically immediately gets really, really bad tendon pain. He doesn't really want to admit it's as bad as it is, and he ends up going to an AT at MIT and essentially does 3 weeks of some sort of rehab, and also I think was training at the time, and eventually also gets PFP and tendon pain. So now he does 2 months of overtime athletes, and he just re-aggravates his PFP. He basically wastes 5 months doing VertShock and then getting hurt and having tendon pain, rehabbing it, then switching to a different program at the time, and then also re-aggravating it and getting hurt again. He said it was so bad that it felt like a knife was actually driving into his cartilage in a quarter squat, and at the time he was probably only touching like 10.8 or 10.10. So then he comes to us, and immediately I realized, hey man, you got a lot of issues. We're gonna have to sort out your knees first. So it's November of 2020, and he does 6 months of bottom up squats to alleviate some of the cartilage pain, which is obviously what I recommend for a lot of guys. And he gets to the point where he can eventually do squats, which is a huge success for him, right? I mean, he went from immense pain to being able to squat pain-free. That is a huge accolade in and of itself. So during this period of time, we continue to train him, and eventually he gets his vert up to about 35 inches, and he's touching about 10, 11. So now he's hitting all-time verticals. Training with us, I was pretty proud of him at this point, and he actually gets his first one-hander off 2 feet, which for him, again, he'd never done. So now he's healthy again, he's able to dunk again, and he's now a 2-foot jumper touching almost 11 feet at the time. He then continues to train with us and eventually gets to the point where he hits a windmill in 2021. So again, at this point, I've maybe windmilled like once or twice. I've done it a handful of times. Webster now has no background. He hasn't not trained to a high degree at all. And training with us for 2 years under the right guidance, he's doing one-handers off 2 feet for the first time, and then eventually gets a windmill off 2 feet, which I think is really, really cool. And to his credit, he worked really, really hard, did all the sorts of things that we recommend to you guys. And if you've watched the podcast or you've seen other videos, you know what that entails. However, during that time, as a result of the jump training and maybe jumping a little too much, he, I think, was playing volleyball at the time and got a little bit of a tendon flare-up. So this is part of the story, and this happens for a lot of guys. But as you're pushing the needle and you're trying to get better, you're going to run into injuries. That happened to Webster obviously many times in the past. And even with us, this happened because he was just doing a little bit too much, gets a little bit of a flare-up. So we did have to sort that out. So 2022 does limited jumping and has to modify the amount of volleyball and basketball he's playing because that was a big reason why. He more or less was doing both trainings. He was doing our training, then playing volleyball and playing basketball, which is way more than I would ever recommend. But he also was getting way, way fitter. He PR'd his squat and his power clean. He ended up getting to a point where he could squat 345, and he actually was power cleaning about 230. So he's gotten way more powerful and way stronger across the couple years that he's worked with us. And his vertical at this point, he thinks he was probably touching maybe around 11 feet. So from the fall of 21 to August of 2022, his squat went from 305 to 350. His power clean went from essentially 0 to 230, and his deadlift went from 315 to 400. At this point, he's able to do off the backboard dunks. He's able to windmill. He's able to do a reverse off vert. He's becoming a much better athlete. So in May of 2022, he essentially is doing a little bit too much sprinting and ends up getting tendon pain again. And you'll keep seeing this kind of theme of Webster getting healthy, pushing too much, doing too much, getting hurt, having to rehab, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is a cycle that a lot of us go through, and it's just part of the human experience of being an athlete. I think the rumor that you can just be healthy forever isn't necessarily accurate, and I think that is a little bit diluted. I think you have to be realistic about the training process. At some point during this time, he also was at Cambridge playing a lot of volleyball. I can't remember if it was his senior year of his PhD or at some point during that period of time, and that was also a big reason why he got hurt, is he was just doing too much. So he eventually finishes his PhD at MIT, and I think he was pretty burned out. So at this point, he's like, look, I just need to chill. I'm having a bunch of little injuries, and I just want to, kind of enjoy life. So he more or less travels, I think, to Europe, backpacks through that. I think he also visited China at the time and really just started to live life a little bit. At this point, he's basically just grinded it out from 2012 all the way until, or 2013, all the way until 2022. So it's like 10 years of just grinding out his education and really getting his degree. And, to his credit, that's a really hard thing to do, but he did end up finishing. And at this point, he just took a little bit of a break. There's nothing wrong with that. He had achieved all these different things as an athlete as well. He far exceeded my expectations of him. And, I think it's totally fair for him to take that time off. So after this, he ends up coming back to training and basically immediately gets quad tendon pain because he hasn't really built up. So he comes back to training with us. And within that period of time, I think it was probably 6 months or so, he gets back to windmilling again and is a way, way better athlete this time around. And the reason for that is because he'd already built up so much training history with us that he could retrain very, very quickly. It's not like he was starting from scratch. He had a very good background in training at this point. So this brings us to right before dunk camp of 2023, I believe, or that fall prior to it, going into 2024 dunk camp where I actually got to meet him for the first time. So during this time, he actually goes crazy and has his best session ever. So he hits a PB flight time, he touches 11.2 and has one of the best sessions that he's ever had. So he starts getting after it in training again, has a little bit of low back pain, which we were able to manage by pulling out some of the loading, and I had to create some really interesting cycles for him at that time. And then goes to dunk camp after having quite a bit of back pain and actually is jumping incredibly well. Wasn't training super well prior to that, but we were able to manage it and get him healthy while also getting him better. So he performed really well, goes back home to Massachusetts, and at this time just starts getting in sessions with guys regularly, getting after it in training, and is able to stay healthy for the first time because he's really solely focusing on dunking and not trying to play basketball and volleyball and do all these other things. So now Webster is power cleaning 235. He actually just back squatted 365 the other day, so congratulations to him as well. He's now touching probably about 11.3, and he's hit flight times of about 860, 870 milliseconds. So he's jumping much, much higher. He's just shy of that 40-inch vertical mark, and I foresee that in his near future. He's hitting cuff windmills. He's hitting cuff slingshots on 9, 10.5, or 9, 10 or whatever, but he's definitely a lot better. And to his credit, he worked really, really hard, was learning a lot of the things that Isaiah, myself, and a lot of the athletes that have learned over the years, which is you got to listen to your body. You have to be able to understand like when you're pushing too much, and ultimately understanding that you can't do too many things at one time. I think it's a big mistake a lot of guys make is they try to just do too much. And you have to be honest with yourself and understand if your goal is to jump higher, then you need to make it a priority. And if you're trying to do volleyball or basketball and all these other things, it's going to be really hard to achieve that goal of jumping higher because you're just spread too thin. And whether it was his MIT degree, or it was his PhD, or it was him trying to be a part of the club volleyball team or play on a team in Cambridge or whatever else, it was just too much for him. And you have to understand that long term, getting better is a process of small choices that compound over time that make you the athlete that you want to be. So shout out to Webster. If you guys are interested in getting coaching by us and hopefully not making the same mistakes that Webster made, go to THPStrength.com and understand that we will help guide you through that process and hold your hand to make sure that you don't have some of these mistakes that Webster made happen to you. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you next time.